So, just 100 years. This is, I have to get this mono. This should be a jigsaw thing. Okay, so Manifesto. So we'll just try to put this on one page. And there's a reason I've done that. Well, the first reason is this is the right thing to do, right? You need to explain what you're doing. And then I'll show you another thing with tweets in a second that adds to this. But this is one page that talks about where I frame the whole thing. So, systems are ubiquitous, right? Everything we can think about, we've talked about these. So many, many different examples, and of course they matter. So much of science becomes eventually about how things fit together. And engineering and all these other pieces, right, becomes about how pieces, elements fit together. As I said, golden age of reductionism, 1700 to 2000, say, you know, so we've got atoms, and then of course the madness of quarks and everything else. But atoms we're pretty solid with. And then things like DNA, genes, and further with people, although the apple cart's a bit upset there. Okay, so this becomes so we have 300 years of this in our time, and then science is all about systems. It has to be. I was going to actually put this up, but I remember a piece in the New York Times maybe 1998 about the genome project, right? The various efforts that were going on then. And the framing around it was, this is going to save, make everyone thin and fit and geniuses, because we'll be able to just like delete things and change things. It's going to be easy because we're going to have everyone's genome and we'll just be able to change it all. So it had this huge promise wrapped around it. And you can understand why people try to do that. But there's a piece that's 10 years later, again in the New York Times, which really it goes back and reflects on that and says, well, actually that didn't work out. And if you've thought about systems or had experience with them, you kind of knew this was going to be the case, because that's genes and then proteins and then protein-protein interactions and there's huge network complications there, and it just keeps going up and up and up. And so we're slowly kind of digging our way up because we have to do a million experiments and analyses to figure out which things interact with which. So there is an element of stamp collecting, which is usually what physicists do when they want to claim everyone else is doing, which is very rude. But right, it was who was it? Dirac, who said my equations explain all of chemistry. The rest is stamp collecting. Anyway, it's not true, right? And we'll get back to that later on. It is not true, and there's a good reason why. It doesn't matter if you know about quarks. You will not predict a platypus. Okay. So here's a big piece, and we'll come back to this over and over and over. This is a huge, so this is a term in physics, but we're going to sort of use it outside. It can get into some danger, I suppose, in some of the social sciences. People might have different thoughts about what this word means there. But universality. So this is the idea that you have these quantitatively sort of different micro details. But they get qualitatively similar macro behavior. So this is like the fluid story, right? We could have fluids made out of different components that behave macroscopically in the same way. Right? They obey the same equations. We can take water and just add some impurities to it, and it's still going to behave like water at a macroscopic scale. There are some very weird things. You can actually make little ball bearings on a grid bounce off each other, and macroscopically, like in your computer, right, just to make a little simulation, and macroscopically it will behave just like a fluid. You can't see the ball bearings because you've zoomed out. You can't see any grid structure. So this is this idea of there are many microscopic kinds of systems, or many systems where the microscopic details differ in some way, but they're similar enough in a sort of broader sense that their macro behavior is the same. So this is an enormous thing, right? And many of these links will go to Wikipedia, by the way, right? Because I think that's okay. When I first started to say, well, look it up on Wikipedia, and they're like, no. Okay, but anyway, I'm okay with that. You'll see people talk about this in different ways. If you might want to look at this, we'll come back to it later on, but in one of those tweet feeds, there's a thing that has a picture of a chicken. It's from Quanta magazine, and it's talking about universality and how things like, what is it? Prime numbers and buses and all sorts of different things having the same qualitative behavior, which is a bit strong, but we'll see. Something to do with random matrices. All right, so, okay. And then, so this is why it's not all just, right? It could be that we have a different equation for honey, or there's no equation for honey. There's no Navier-Stokes equation for honey. and a different equation for milk and a different equation for water, and right, it's not a priori even clear that we could write, math could actually, come into the world and we could use it. But even on top of that, it's not absolutely clear that all these things would have the same sort of stories underneath. We get into some danger here, right? Because people will start, and there's a literature full of this sort of thing where people will say, oh, I can model magnets really well out of interacting pieces. I will use that for how people vote. Okay, so there's some dangerous stuff that people do here. So not everything is the same. All right, it's not that bad, but there is broad enough universality, and there are broad enough patterns that you see across many, many fields that we're at a point where it is good to know what happens in ecology and what happens in language and what happens in, how the starts of chess, for example. I mean, there are all these sort of patterns that match up. And we might understand, the normal distribution, that's everywhere, right? So, that's a good nutritious thing, but there are some bigger, deeper, what I'll call statistics of surprise that matter as well. And then this is the world we live in now, right? So computing makes lots of things possible. We can tweet, but it also means we can record all of this stuff, and we've got the right instrumentation. Big piece is making the right instrumentation. Put it in, machines, and then both analyze it and simulate it. Now, this will all seem pretty simple to you, I suppose, now, but I'm as old as the internet, right? So Stranger Things is kind of my childhood, but with walkie-talkies and BMXs. But there's this huge, it was a very quiet time, right? You couldn't actually, like grew up on a farm, there was a couple of TV channels, but you couldn't just get things, right? You couldn't ask for things. You couldn't go and find pictures of cats on Instagram, which was probably good, but just pretend you lived in the Dukes of Hazzard world. Okay, so it's my middle brother, actually. Welded the door shut on the vehicle. Oh dear. So, but it's such a huge change, and of course you guys are immersed in it, but this is massive, right? People didn't think about this in the 1800s, and to some extent in the 1900s you can go back in time and see people talking about, well, weather prediction. If we had a lot of people in a room doing calculations, and of course the first computers were people, right? That was a job position. It's not a job position anymore. We had one of our former students is the Media Lab, Morgan Frank, talking the other day, and he's doing all this fantastic work on skills and jobs and cities, like how they're distributed around the US in particular, and what it means for cities. Can Detroit move in this way? Can a small city move in this way? Which ones are in trouble with robotics coming along and that sort of thing, AI coming along? And he had the claim that there's only one job title that has gone out of existence in the last 50 years, which was interesting. And the question was, what is that? Any guesses? I know I'm sort of diverging a little bit, but I was talking about the job of a computer, because people don't do that anymore. They'll have some job, but they aren't a computer. Apparently it's elevator operator, right? But I know, so there's still one at Tiffany's in New York City, so, but I think that might last forever. Anyway, computers, that's where we are, and it's not just us. So I think a lot of computing is really, AI is getting this big brand now, but it's socio-technical computation is the really powerful thing. It's people plus computers, right? Even if you think about, say, the start of Google, which was amazing when it first appeared, right? A friend of mine came into my office and said, look at this thing, and it would just work. We had all these search engines before, like Excite and Lycos and Alta Vista, which were kind of terrible, right? And the thing about Google was it used network structure, which we'll get to. Anyway, so just a really powerful kind of transition in what's possible. Maybe I lost the thread there. Okay, so this is really the summary of it. The big things are we can do these pieces. We always needed to, right? We needed to be able to do it, and people had looked into the future and said maybe one day we'll be able to measure all these things and so on. We have this work on measuring happiness, for example. There's a paper in the 1800s of an economist saying, well, if we knew everyone's happiness level, we could do this. But this is a big deal, and we'll come back to this over and over throughout. All right, that's a manifesto. I guess I didn't have this piece. Yes, there it is. Those words both those things are there. Measure and record. and simulate and model. If you look at the VAC that we have here at Vermont, we're still moving that towards being a data-focused thing, right? Because it was set up as a big parallel computing piece, which was great for things like fluid mechanics, which is tremendous. But there's still this slow march towards being in a data-centric world. All right. Okay. So, I want to get that in there, and I think. So let me see if I can find this. It's this. Yeah, it's this madness here. I guess that's not obvious. Yep. So there's just a question thrown out there. How would you explain in layman words what your research on complexity is about? And of course, I didn't quite answer it. Tagged a whole bunch of people. It's this one. Tagged a whole bunch of people, and then it just kind of exploded, right? So, I mean, I guess this isn't huge by Donald Trump standards, but lots of responses here, right? Yeah, look, I threw a shovel in. But this goes on and on and on. Someone starts talking about bacon. Yeah, so I think this guy just really wanted to explain it to his uncle, so that's maybe what that was. All right. But that was yesterday. I was like, ah. All right, so complex systems are a thing. They totally exist, and we've just got to get on with it, right? So that's what I want to say.